Can you imagine anything worse? You've just bought your dream airplane, the one you've wanted for years. You've signed the paperwork and now finally own it. You're incredibly excited. You travel to where it's located, do a final inspection of the airplane, shake hands, jump in the plane, and start your way home. Unfortunately, you don't make it home and you crash somewhere along the way. Believe it or not, this story happens over and over again. Sometimes the crash isn't on the way home, but it occurs within a few weeks of getting the airplane home. Years ago, I noticed a number of aircraft accidents like this. So I did a search of the NTSB database using phrases such as recently purchased, and I found a boatload of these accidents. So many, in fact, that I created a presentation that I gave numerous times called How to Buy an Airplane and Not Crash on the Way Home. The crash of November 8924 Yankee, a Piper Twin Comanche, has a number of things in common with many of those accidents. It involved a very long day of flying for many hours, so fatigue was likely a factor. Get there-itis or get-home-itis was a factor. The pilot said he needed to get back, and many new plane owners are motivated to get home for work on Monday. The pilot had relatively low time in the aircraft make and model, and the accident happened at night in dark night conditions with no moon. As I've mentioned before, the NTSB says that 90% of night accidents occur in dark night conditions when there is no moon or it's obscured by an overcast layer. And while this aircraft did have a 50-year-old autopilot, it apparently wasn't working as the pilot hand flew the entire trip. Today, this episode is dedicated to the memory of Rob Prestininzi, who sadly died in this accident. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week in episode 327, we talked about the crash of a Bonanza A36 in Kentucky that involved a doctor who flew below instrument minimums and without a clearance and paid the ultimate price. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/327. And if you're new to this show, well, welcome. Great to have you here. And if you would take a moment right now and touch either the subscribe key or, if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. But first, let me remind you that this is a listener-supported show and that we have several new ways that you can show your love and support for the show. So if you've been listening for a while and you feel that you're getting value from this show, well, please go out to our support page at aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find links to support the show via PayPal, Venmo, Zelle, and Patreon. And when you make a donation, I'll read your name on the show. First, my thanks to Aaron Benjamin, who brought this accident to my attention. Aaron's been a supporter of Aviation News Talk via Patreon for the past 18 months. He recently increased his support level to $50 a month, which makes him our newest mega supporter. And when he increased his support level, he emailed me and wrote, "Hi, Max. I've been listening to your show since I was a student pilot in 2019. I've received so much benefit from Aviation News Talk that I'm happy to increase my support level. I'm an instrument-rated pilot and the owner of a 1979 Cessna 182RG based at Charlene Monroe Executive, KEQY, in North Carolina. Please keep up the great work at keeping me safe when I fly. I would like to make my monthly donation to honor the memory of my friend and CFII, Rob Prestininzi. I miss him every time I fly." I wrote back and said in part, "I'll definitely mention your friend Rob Prestininzi. Would you like me to mention any of the specifics of his accident, or just mention that you're donating in his memory?" Here's a recording he sent back.
Hi, Max. Thank you for devoting an episode of Aviation News Talk to analyzing the accident that tragically took the life of my friend and CFII, Rob Prestininzi. Rob was a great guy and a fantastic instructor. I finished my instrument training with Rob, and after I passed that check ride, I would still call Rob from time to time on a bad weather day to go up an actual IMC so that I could stay not just current, but proficient, something Rob always encouraged. I called Rob after my first instrument approach in actual IMC in New Orleans, and then again a few days later to help me plan emergency procedures on my first takeoff into 600-foot overcast. Rob was always generous with his time, his instructional abilities, and his always sound advice, grounded in solid ADM. I had mixed feelings about an episode discussing Rob's accident, but ever the generous teacher, I think Rob would have wanted the opportunity for others to learn from that accident. Max, thank you for all you do to promote aviation safety, and thank you for this episode in memory of my friend.
Thank you, Aaron. Now, let me first tell you a little about Robert Prestininzi. He was 49 years old and had a bachelor's from Middle Tennessee State University and a master's degree from Mississippi State. He first served in law enforcement and later became a mortgage officer. In 2020, he became a flight instructor. He was an avid runner, completing over 1,500-mile runs. He had a family and is survived by his wife, Brianna, and two sons, Slater, age 10, and Kai, just 1 month old. His obituary said that Rob was an avid smiler. Anyone blessed with the privilege of spending time with Rob will attest that seeing his smile made it impossible not to smile with him. You were left feeling like you had just been with someone who thought you were the most important person in the world. From Rob's logbook, it says he got his private and commercial and multi-engine rating all in 1991 and his flight instructor certificate almost 30 years later in 2020, about a year and a half before the accident. He had a first-class medical and an estimated total time of 1,046 hours. The NTSB final report says that he had a total of 9 hours in make and model, which doesn't agree with other documents that indicated he had more time than that, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Rob's dream airplane that he was bringing home was November 8924 Yankee, a 1969 PA-30 Piper Twin Comanche. According to an NTSB witness statement from his friend James Burns, Rob had always talked about buying a Twin Comanche and finally got one. Rob had been his CFII, had trained him, and then they became friends and started to fly together. They'd known each other for about 2 years. Mr. Burns stated that on the day of the accident, he flew Rob to KSNH in Savannah, Tennessee. They flew out of KUZA IFR to SNH, departing around 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, arriving about 10:30 Central Daylight Time. He says he sat there with him for 1 to 2 hours while the avionics guy showed him everything. Rob said, "Okay, well, it's time to go." Mr. Burns stated that the mechanic had not left the maintenance logbooks in the airplane, so Rob had to fly to Alabama to get the logbooks, and he flew home. Now, I've looked at the ADSB ground tracks for the flight home, and here's what I found. The aircraft departed KSNH, the Savannah-Hardin County Airport, located in western Tennessee, on a Friday about 6 hours before the crash at 12:20 p.m. Central Daylight Time. The aircraft flew southeast for about 40 minutes at an altitude that varied between 1,500 and 1,700 feet at a ground speed of about 115 knots. A mechanic mentioned in his statement that there was an overcast layer, which is probably why this aircraft flew so low throughout the entire trip. It landed for fuel at the Hartselle-Morgan County Airport 5 Mike 0, which is southwest of Huntsville, Alabama. It was on the ground for just slightly over an hour and took off around 3 p.m. Eastern Time and departed to the southeast. It flew about an hour and landed at LaGrange. It was on the ground for approximately 30 minutes and took off at 4:38 p.m. It departed to the northeast toward its final destination. Maximum altitude was 3,500 feet, and the speed averaged around 120 knots. Everything appeared normal for the 2-hour flight to Rock Hill, York County, which has a field elevation of 666 feet. About 3 miles from the airport, at 6:35 p.m. local and at 2,100 feet, the aircraft turned away from the airport and began flying erratic circles southwest of the field for nearly an hour. Note that sunset was 11 minutes earlier at 6:24 p.m., civil twilight was at 7:22 p.m., so it would have been completely dark when the crash occurred 4 minutes after civil twilight. During the last 4 minutes of the flight, the plane started getting lower and lower. When it was 9 miles south of the airport and heading southeast, it turned back to the north toward the airport. At the beginning of the turn, the aircraft was at 88 knots and 1,900 feet. In the next 2 minutes, it got as slow as 72 knots and 1,600 feet. Now, we don't have data for the next 2 minutes, probably because the plane was so low. ADSB Exchange did capture a final data point 2 miles later at 72 knots and 1,300 feet, while the plane was still 4.5 miles away from the airport. Now let's go to the NTSB final report. It says in part, on November 5th, 2021, about 7:26 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, a Piper PA-30 November 8924 Yankee was substantially damaged when it was involved in an accident near Rock Hill Airport, KUZA, in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Earlier in the day, the pilot was a passenger in a friend's airplane that departed UZA for Savannah-Hardin County Airport, SNH, in Savannah, Tennessee, where the accident pilot would pick up the accident airplane, which he had recently purchased. The mechanic who had performed the last annual inspection on the airplane received a call from the pilot while he was at SNH. During the call, the pilot told the mechanic that he would be making his first flight in the Piper PA-30 Twin Comanche and asked him about the fuel tanks. The pilot indicated that he was going to the Hartselle-Morgan County Regional Airport, 5 Mike 0, in Alabama to pick up the airplane's logbooks. The pilot later called the mechanic from 5M0. According to the mechanic, the pilot stated, "Well, I made my first flight in the Twin Comanche, and everything went great." The pilot further stated that he had picked up the airplane's logbooks and that his next stop was LaGrange Callaway Airport, KLGC in Georgia, before returning to KUZA. Fuel purchase receipts indicated that 35.8 gallons of 100 low-lead aviation fuel were purchased at LGC about 4:20 p.m. The ADSB data indicated that the airplane departed LGC about 4:36 p.m. and flew in a northeasterly direction, climbing to a cruise altitude between about 3,000 and 3,500 feet mean sea level. About 6:35 p.m. and about 4 nautical miles from KUZA, the airplane began a descent to 2,000 feet MSL. The pilot called the mechanic from the airplane at about 6:38 p.m. to report that he was near KUZA and that the landing gear circuit breaker kept popping. ADSB data showed that the airplane was maneuvering southwest of UZA at an altitude between 1,000 and 2,000 feet MSL, while the mechanic provided guidance on the manual gear extension process. The calls repeatedly dropped, but the final call began about 7:13 p.m. and dropped about 7:26 p.m. after the pilot stated that he needed to add some power. ADSB data at that time showed the airplane at an altitude of 1,025 feet MSL, which would be less than 400 feet AGL, and a ground speed of 63 knots. The last flight track data point showed the airplane at 625 feet MSL, which would have been virtually ground level, near the accident site. The airplane impacted a wooded area about 3.5 nautical miles south of UZA. The airplane came to rest in an upright, nose-down attitude. All major components of the airplane were located at the accident site. Review of the pilot's logbook revealed that he had logged a total of 62 hours of multi-engine flight time at the time of the accident. The pilot's logbook included 2 entries regarding flights in the accident aircraft make and model, a multi-leg flight on May 20th, 2020, with a reported duration of 15 hours. Now, separately in the witness statements, I found that the NTSB contacted the CFI in Michigan, where that training was completed. The CFI witness statement says, quote, "He checked his logbooks and verified that he flew with Mr. Prestininzi for 8 hours on May 20th, 2020, and for 7 hours on May 20, 2020. Now, that's apparently an error, as later the report says the training occurred on 2 separate days, though I've seen the logbook entry which shows that all 15 hours occurred on May 20th, which seems unlikely. In the notes for that date, it says, completed full insurance checkout. The report continues, the flight on May 20, 2020, which included time from a flight conducted the day before, was confirmed. And by that, they probably mean via ADSB data. Back to the report, there was another flight on March 23, 2021, with a reported duration of 5 hours, which according to the logbook was conducted at Pickens County Airport, KLQK, Pickens, South Carolina. But the NTSB wrote that ADSB information for March 23, 2021, revealed only a 54-minute local flight at Goshen Municipal, that's KGSH, in Goshen, Indiana. So that's a discrepancy that was not resolved in the report. How did the pilot get 5.1 hours of multi-engine training in South Carolina in a plane that was flying that day in Indiana? So the pilot apparently had 20 hours of experience in make and model, though the report summary said 9 hours. But most of that training was 18 months earlier, and the most recent flight was more than 7 months before the accident flight. Now, the witness statement from the mechanic is interesting. It says, the following is a summary of a conversation that occurred with the individual named above. The mechanic stated that Robert just bought the airplane last spring and that he had met him only one time. On the day of the accident, Robert was in Savannah, and the mechanic was at Abernathy Field, KGZS, in Pulaski, Tennessee. The mechanic received a call from Robert asking about which tanks were the mains and which were the aux tanks. The mechanic assumed it to be his first flight. The mechanic who had been maintaining the airplane responded that there were 8 fuel tanks on the airplane, but that to return home, he would only need to fill the main and auxiliary tanks. Robert responded that he only wanted to fill the main tanks and wanted to know which those were. The mechanic told him that the main tanks were inboard of the engine nacelles, and Robert asked if he was sure. The mechanic explained that yes, he was sure the main tanks were inboard of the engine nacelles and held 30 gallons each, and the auxiliary tanks were outboard of the engine nacelles and held 15 gallons each. This conversation concerned the mechanic. He had thought that perhaps Robert was an airline pilot, but he was thinking to himself, if you don't know which tanks are the main tanks, you don't know this airplane. He wanted to be diplomatic, so he said, "Robert, leave that thing there. That thing has been sitting for years. Take a rental car and go home. Come back next week and I can check you out in it." Robert stated that he, quote, needed to get back, and said that he was going to fly to his place, the mechanic's business located at Hartselle-Morgan County Regional Airport, 5 Mike 0 in Hartselle, Alabama, to pick up the airplane logbooks. Later that day at 1:05 p.m., Robert called the mechanic from 5M0. He greeted the mechanic with, "Well, I made my first flight in the Twin Comanche." The mechanic responded, "How did it go?" Robert responded, "Everything went great." Robert told him that he had gotten the logbooks from the girl who worked for the mechanic. He asked about some oil on the nose wheel strut. The mechanic asked him to send a photo. He said, quote, "As long as it's holding air, you're okay." Robert stated, quote, "Well, I'm going to go on then." And again, the mechanic was concerned because there was some weather east of them with low ceilings. He stated that he, quote, didn't know his experience level, and I wanted to err on the safe side. He again encouraged him to leave the airplane and take a car, telling him, "Come back next week and I will fly with you." Robert declined and let him know that his next stop was LaGrange, Georgia. Robert called him at 6:38 p.m. Eastern time from the airplane. He said that he had a gear problem. However, it was very difficult to hear him and the call kept dropping. He said he was having a circuit breaker continue to pop for the landing gear. The mechanic told him he could manually extend the landing gear, to which Robert responded, "Well, I am pulling on the red handle." The mechanic explained to him that there are 2 red handles, but he could tell that Robert was stressed. The mechanic said, "Let's just start at the beginning, and I'm going to talk you through this." But the call kept dropping, and they would start again. Quote, "There are 2 red handles. Pull the circuit breaker, release the jack screw handle, and that frees the gear from the motor. You release the jack screw, then you grab the other red handle and you stick it in the hole and you push." The mechanic could tell that Robert was straining his voice and he was trying to calm him down. Robert sent him a photo of the handle and the mechanic saw that he had released the jack screw. "Okay, now you need to find the emergency extension handle." Robert seemed hyper-focused and the mechanic had to start over several times. Robert was looking and could not find it, but then finally found it. The mechanic told him to put it in one of the 2 holes that were at offset angles in the torque tube. Quote, "You push the handle till it goes over center until the gear is locked." But it was like it was not registering with Robert what I was trying to describe. Robert said, "Gotta add some power," and the phone went dead. He tried to return the call, but it never answered. The last call started at 7:13 Eastern Time and lasted 13 minutes. Now, that means the call would have ended at 7:26 p.m., which is the time the NTSB says that the aircraft crashed. Now, apparently the pilot knew about the landing gear issue before he arrived at his home airport. According to the witness statement from his wife, she said, quote, "He said he was leaving and that he would call her. He called once he landed at the airport and again once he landed in Alabama to get the logbooks. Then he called her in Georgia to let her know that there seemed to be an issue with the landing gear, but he felt it was okay and he was departing for Rock Hill. He was talking what seemed like a long time to Mrs. Prestininzi, so she and her son were calling and texting him. Her first call to him went to voicemail. However, he answered the second call. Her husband stated, "I can't get the landing gear to come down. I am circling the airport, and I will call you once I land." His tone was aggravated. She did not talk to him further after that. So apparently the pilot knew that he was having some kind of landing gear issue before he took off for the final leg of the trip. Continuing on with the report, all landing gear were in the down and locked position at the time of the accident. The landing gear lights, up, in transit, and down locked, were field tested with a DC power source. The amber up and white in-transit lights were determined to be functional, but the green down-locked light was found to not be functional. Laboratory testing of the green landing gear down-locked light bulb revealed that the bulb filament had fractured and that no hot filament stretching was present, indicating that the bulb was either burned out before impact or was not illuminated at the time of impact. The timing of the filament fracture could not be determined. Given the burned-out light bulb and the position of the landing gear at the time of the accident, it is likely that the landing gear indication, the pop circuit breaker, was erroneous and that the gear was down and locked while the pilot was attempting to manually lower the landing gear. Given that ADSB data showed the plane was at 1,025 feet MSL and 63 knot ground speed at the time that the pilot indicated that he needed to add power, it is likely that, with his focus on the manual gear extension process and phone calls, the pilot failed to monitor his airspeed. The airplane likely slowed below its stall speed, resulting in an exceedance of the airplane's critical angle of attack, which led to an aerodynamic stall from which the pilot could not recover because of the airplane's low altitude. Probable cause: the pilot's exceedance of the airplane's critical angle of attack while troubleshooting a landing gear indication, which resulted in an aerodynamic stall at low altitude. Now let's talk a little about what the pilot was trying to accomplish during the last 51 minutes of the flight as he was trying to troubleshoot the landing gear. The first challenge was the manual gear extension. It's under the floor, between and forward of the two front seats. To access it, one first must remove a panel on the floor. Imagine having to bend all the way down to the floor to access the panel with your right hand while continuing to hand fly the aircraft with your left hand. On top of that, the pilot was apparently unfamiliar with the emergency gear release system. I've watched the process on a YouTube video, and it's non-trivial if someone hasn't recently walked you through the procedure. Next, the pilot was talking on a cell phone that kept disconnecting. If he didn't have a way to connect the phone to his headset, then he would have been flying with his left hand, holding the phone with his right hand, and then would have to put the phone down to execute the manual gear extension. In a situation like this, it would have been great to have a second pilot on board, something I strongly recommend anytime you have to fly a long trip to pick up a new-to-you aircraft. And by the way, I do many of these kinds of trips with pilots who've just bought a new-to-them Cirrus or Vision jet. So if you're buying one of these, or especially if you're thinking about buying a new Cirrus, please contact me at max@aviationnewstalk.com. The next challenge is that the aircraft had to be slow. According to the Piper Twin Comanche C PA-30 Owner's Handbook, the stalling speed with gear and flaps down was 69 miles an hour, and the stalling speed with gear and flaps up was 76 miles per hour. The handbook's instructions for emergency extension of landing gear stated the following. 1. Reduce power, airspeed not to exceed 100 miles per hour. So that explains why the aircraft was so slow. The aircraft also had to be low. For most of the 51 minutes that the aircraft was circling, it was below the 4,000-foot shelf of the Charlotte-class Bravo. So it couldn't climb very high unless it flew further away from the destination airport. After reducing power, the remaining steps were to, number 2, place landing gear selector switch in gear down locked position. 3, disengage motor, raise motor release arm and push forward through full travel. 4, remove gear extension handle from stowage. So the pilot had to search in the plane for where this short handle was stowed, and it was dark while he was doing that. It continues, there are 2 holes at different angles, and the handle is to be inserted in whichever socket is accessible. The checklist says, if left socket is not in clear position, place handle in right socket. Engage slot and twist clockwise to secure handle. Extend handle and rotate forward until left socket is in clear position. Remove handle and place in left socket and secure. Extend handle. Rotate handle full forward to extend landing gear and to engage emergency safety lock. 5. Handle locked in full forward position indicates landing gear is down and emergency safety lock engaged. Gear down locked indicator light should be on. Of course, in this case, the green light was not on as the bulb was burned out. One thing the pilot could have done would have been to swap 2 of the bulbs to test whether the gear down bulb was burned out. But if he had been flying mostly fixed gear aircraft, he probably wouldn't have thought to do that. But probably one of the biggest problems the pilot faced was that eventually it became pitch dark outside the airplane, and there was no moon. The new moon was on the prior day, and on the day of the accident, what sliver of a moon there was only provided 1.1% of normal illumination, and what little moon there was set 17 minutes before the accident. Now, here's a sad fact. At nearly every pilot funeral I've been to, someone always comments that he was a good pilot, and I'm sure in most cases that is true. Arguably, this pilot had a fair amount of time, though perhaps he could have benefited from getting some more recent experience in the aircraft make and model prior to bringing the aircraft home. Or, as he began facing various obstacles, he could have left the aircraft somewhere, rented a car, and driven home. I've had to do that in the past, and those were some of the best decisions I've ever made. But even the best pilots can become fatigued or task-saturated to the point where they lose control of the aircraft. Which is why as pilots, we want to build margin into everything we do, so that we can have 1 or 2 mistakes and still recover from them without crashing. In this case, The pilot got too slow and stalled the airplane. If he'd done his troubleshooting at a higher altitude, maybe farther away from the airport, he would have had more margin to recover from a stall. But it was the end of a very long day. The pilot had flown 2.5 hours with his friend, then spent nearly 2 hours getting the plane ready to fly, and then spent a total of 6 hours moving his airplane, including 2 stops along the way. And all of the flying he did was by hand, under low ceilings, without the benefit of an autopilot. I don't know about you, but I get tired after a 10-hour flying day with multiple legs, and every plane that I fly has a good autopilot. So he must have been fatigued, and that can affect our decision-making. And any of us can have get-home-itis or get-there-itis. You may recall the mechanic's statement in which he said, quote, Robert stated that he needed to get back. Please remember that none of us ever needs to get back. We may think that we need to get back, and that perceived need can lead us to take unnecessary risks. And related to that, listener and former CFI Larry Brown wrote to me a few days ago about the TBM accident at Truckee, California that we've talked about. He said, quote, listening to your comments the pilot may not have considered, and the external pressures pilots sometimes face, whereas my car, will I be late for an appointment, the drive will be 30 minutes longer, etc., made me think of the things I used to tell my students. Do things that put yourself below the average accident rate. There is an accident rate for everything. Falling in the bathtub, flying IMC when not rated. If you are a VFR, avoid IMC. Don't take off downwind in your Cherokee 140 while over gross weight on a 90-degree summer day. The other comment I used to make to students in reference to get-home-itis was, quote, I am not so important to where I have to be somewhere. Well, one day I told a student that, and he said back to me, well, I am so important to my family that I don't have to be there. Spoken 2 different ways, but both make sense and good words to fly by. Thanks again for what you do for the aviation community. So please believe that you're important enough to your family that they'd much rather you'd be a day late than to never make it home again. And when you believe that, you will make better choices. Getting back to where this whole discussion started, when Aaron wrote to me, he also said the accident was upsetting enough when it happened and later when we read the NTSB preliminary report. I only got around to being able to read the final report this January, and knowing that the gear was down all along and that he died over a $3 light bulb made it so much worse. What are some things the pilot could have done differently? As I mentioned before, he could have tried swapping the landing gear bulbs to see if the bulb was burned out. He could have done a flyover of the airport to ask if someone could visually verify that his gear was down. One of the witness statements came from someone at the airport who heard him call in on the radio, so there was someone there who could have done that. Of course, he would have had to do that immediately after he arrived while there was still some daylight. Also, some Twin Comanches have mirrors on the engine nacelles so that pilots can verify whether the gear is in the down position. That's one of the first things I added to the Cessna T210 that I owned nearly 25 years ago. It's a very inexpensive option that adds a lot of peace of mind. Or, when he knew that there was some kind of landing gear problem, as he told his wife at the prior stop in Georgia, he could have left the plane there, rented a car, and gotten home that way. On multiple occasions, I've had to leave an airplane short of my destination and continue by car. You should always have that in mind as an automatic plan B or plan C so that you can quickly gravitate to that solution if you encounter issues of any kind. Remember, when we fly GA aircraft, we don't have all the resources of the airlines, so we should expect that we'll cancel a flight more often than the airlines do. Hopefully, when you fly, you'll remember Rob Prestininzi. You'll remember that, like you, he was a good pilot. And yet, even good pilots get fatigued, which clouds decision-making. And any of us can become overloaded and task-saturated. And in those circumstances, we don't always make the best choices. In this case, even if the pilot had landed and had a gear-up landing, it would have been covered by insurance. And that would have been a much better outcome than getting slow and stalling while trying to discover that a light bulb had burned out. Now, did you take away any nuggets of information from this discussion that might help you in the future? One of my goals for the show is to get you to think and to hopefully take away one or more valuable nuggets that will help you fly more safely. And if you've been listening to the show for a while and you've been finding a few of these nuggets that are helping you, I'd like to ask for your help in return, because this is a listener-supported show, and it's really the support from people like you that lets me take time off from teaching, which is my main job, to spend time researching and writing and producing the show for you. So I'd like to invite you to join the club now and become part of the community that makes this all possible. And when you're thinking about how much to donate, well, you might think about what you pay to fly for an hour and make a one-time donation, or think of it like any of the many subscriptions you already have, whether it's for Netflix or Hulu or Amazon Prime or Apple TV Plus, and make a regular monthly donation, which you can set up to occur automatically via Patreon or PayPal. And it's so easy to do. Just go out on the web to aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find 4 different ways to support this show. And if you choose to donate via Patreon, you'll get some goodies at the various contribution levels. And regardless of the support level that you choose on Patreon, you'll get access to a different version of this show where you won't hear me asking you to support the show because you've already done it. That's our ad-free version. And of course, when you do sign up, I'll read your name on the show. Thanks so much for your help. And you can also support the show when you buy a Lightspeed headset. Now, I've been using only Lightspeed headsets for over 25 years. I currently have 4 of their different models, which I use in different airplanes and helicopters. 2 of my favorite things about Lightspeed are their trade-up program and their support. The trade-up program lets you trade in an older Lightspeed headset for a new model, and they'll give you hundreds of dollars of credit for your old headset. I've used that program at least 3 or 4 times over the years to trade up to newer models, and I love it because it preserves my investment that I made in the original headset. And their support is great. They've never charged me a penny for fixing any of my headsets, and their turnaround time is relatively short, which is important to me, as I often fly 5 days a week. When you buy a new headset from Lightspeed, they will send a donation to the show, but only if you use one of the links in our show notes first to get to their website. To find those links, just go out on the web and type in aviationnewstalk.com/Lightspeed. By the way, my favorite model is the Lightspeed Delta Zulu because I have some hearing loss, and the Delta Zulu has a built-in frequency equalizer that you can custom tune to your ears to compensate for any hearing loss. It took me only just a few minutes to set that up, and I find that it makes it a little easier for me to understand ATC transmissions. Again, check out all of their models by going to aviationnewstalk.com/Lightspeed. Thanks so much. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. But probably the best way you can support the show is by telling all of your friends about Aviation News Talk. And if they're not familiar with how to listen to a podcast, and probably half the population doesn't know how to do it, show them how they can subscribe to the show for free on their smartphone. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up, and remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around if it don't look right coming down. Don't wait until your side's maybe sliding upside down.